Hey guys, welcome to the concluding video for SMART. We're going to look at how SMART had arrived at conclusions based on his overall exploration of anticipated objections and replies. So let's look at our overall goal. We want to read and record our understanding of SMART's conclusions, and we're going to explore some criticisms of SMART's conclusions, which means, as usual, we have to name, define, and of course interrelate different key terms to form arguments. And then we need to outline his concluding points. What actually are they? We're going to explore the validity of SMART's appeal to the nature of science, which has been a bit of a criticism of SMART. And secondly, we're going to look at the problem of qualia, and we're going to see how that is also a bit of a criticism of SMART. So can you please write down these 3 success criteria, score yourself out of 4 for each of them, and have a look at this picture and just write down a brief explanation about what you see. Cheers. All right, now SMART basically finishes off and says, look, science in an empirical sense is where I'm arriving at, all right? But the problem is that his actual thesis, or what he's been exploring, is a bit more complicated than just a straightforward scientific or empirical thesis, all right? He concludes, when you actually go ahead and read him, that there is no real empirical evidence to actually, I should start from here. There actually is a lot of evidence to say that when comparing different other supposed hypotheses for what could be making mental states occur, there's pretty much lots of evidence to say, well, we can't claim the liver thesis, which is basically, hey, look, what the liver does makes the mental processes happen. We can't do the same for the heart. We can't do the same for the kidneys, because there's ample evidence to say that what's going on in the brain corresponds with, in a contingent way, but it still corresponds with or correlates with what actually goes on in mental states. So as far as he's concerned, when comparing the different kind of material hypotheses, say for instance between brain, liver, heart, and kidneys, for explaining what actually happens or what could correlate highly with mental states, it's no issue basically. The brain has won. We can't reject the argument of the brain hypothesis. Take a note. But the point is basically when he says when we're just comparing other kind of material object language based hypotheses, we tend to favor one, and we've got ample evidence to suggest using material object language which one is correct, and that's the brain. But the problem is there's no scientific way of testing the conclusions generated by epiphenomenalism. Now remember, you probably should write down a definition of what epiphenomenalism is. It's the argument that, and it's a very strict definition, that mental states are caused by physical events in the brain, but they have no effect on physical events, and that these mental states are separate. Okay, so epiphenomenalism is kind of an argument that mental states emerge out of the brain, but they still have their own kind of reality. All right, take a note. So he argues there's really no empirical evidence or no way of empirically testing whether materialism is right or whether or not dualism is right, and epiphenomenalism is one of those dualist theories. So, all right, when we're having a debate about this particular idea, what do we conclude? Well, he goes on to say, look, when you think about it, when looking at the debate between materialism and epiphenomenalism, which is another form of dualism, again, remember there is no evidence, empirical evidence to help you answer the question either way, but there are analogies that we can point to in the past, and one of them is pretty much the evolution versus creationism debate, okay, which really is making us look at what we call the scientific reductionist argument, or other arguments that may still have room for science, but also nomologically dangle other explanations on top of it. All right. And he refers to this creationist here by the name of Gossi. Now, Gossi argued that the Earth was still around about 4,000 years old, and it was God who created the Earth, but God put dinosaur fossils in there to make it look like the Earth was much older than it actually was. But still, the creationist account holds true because God put the dinosaurs in there. Can you take a note? That's what Gossi argued, right? Now remember, there should also be notes taken about the fact that he argues that you can't really find empirical evidence to decide which one would be more correct, a dualist theory like epiphenomenalism or a materialist theory. But we can point to analogies in the past, so there should also be notes about that as well. And of course, one of them is the creationist argument that tries to explain away fossils in the ground. All right, now to most young scientists today, this would seem very strange. But as you can see between the, when you're looking at the debate between dualism and materialism, or epiphenomenalism and materialism, you can't really have empirical evidence to prove or disprove Gossi's hypothesis. I mean, there could very well be a all-powerful being that created these fossils and made them look like they were millions or billions of years of old, a billion years old, yeah? So take a note. So his conclusion is there is no empirical evidence to prove or disprove Gossi's hypothesis. So where do we go now? Where's our refuge? Well, he says, look, even though we can't empirically prove or disprove Gossi's hypothesis, we can refer to Occam's razor as a guiding principle. Okay? And remember, Occam's razor is based on parsimony, which basically means don't overuse explanations. Use just as many as you need, and simplicity in design. Okay? And what he concludes is basically, well, the only real method of knowing or explaining what happened with the fossils is the scientific one, because it is parsimonious. In other words, it doesn't overuse explanations. It doesn't nomenologically dangle. Okay? And it's simple. If we were to go with Gossi's explanation, we would have thousands more explanations and things to explore, and we just wouldn't have the benefit of a parsimonious and simplistic explanation. So he's more likely to side with the argument, the scientific explanation of the fossils, which is based on evolution. Take a note. All right, so then Smart says, look, this whole debate between which side do you fall on, the side of creationism or the side of evolutionism, evolutionary theory, also relates to the debate between dualism, of which, remember, epiphenomenalism is a form of dualism, and materialism, okay? Or I've got the picture of the brain's processes engaging in a material sense here, just to illustrate what materialism is. And remember, basically, Descartes was a dualist. Let's not forget that. He wasn't an epiphenomenalist. Descartes believed that the mind had agency over the material world. Okay? Epiphenomenalism is just an argument that what's the word I'm looking for? That there is a reality over and above the material world that can't be accounted for by the material world. There's a separate reality. And he just says, look, dualism is a nomenologically dangling theory. I mean, if you look at science, you can reduce everything to scientific processes and exclude a lot of other unnecessary explanations for our mental states. Take a note. In fact, if we read along, he kind of says, look, there are a lot of absurd psychophysical laws that are generated by any form of dualism that you just have to take on trust because they can never be empirically tested. But you can always develop empirical logic or empirical observations to see the correlations between brain states and mental states. Take a note. So let's read through and see if my summary has been accurate, shall we? Let's have a look-see. I now have considered a number of objections to the brain process thesis. I wish now to conclude by some remarks on the logical status of the thesis itself. UT Place seems to hold that it is a straight-out scientific hypothesis. In other words, he's saying strict identity theory, i.e. brain states equal mental states, was claimed by another theorist, UT Place, as a pure scientific hypothesis. And he's saying, no, that's not the case. If so, he is partly right and partly wrong. If the issue is between, say, a brain process thesis and a heart thesis or a liver thesis or a kidney thesis, then the issue is purely empirical. And the verdict is overwhelmingly in favor of the brain. We've repeated that, basically saying other theses developed by material object language, you know, they don't have the same amount of evidence that the brain thesis does, okay? The right sorts of things do not go in the heart, liver, or kidney, nor do the organs possess the right sort of complexity of structure. On the other hand, if the issues between brain or heart or liver or kidney thesis, that is some form of materialism, okay, that's why I said material object language before, on the one hand, and epiphenomenalism on the other. Remember, epiphenomenalism is one type of dualism. Basically, mental states emerge out of material states, but they don't affect the material world, but they do have a separate reality, okay? On the other hand, then the issue is not empirical. So he's saying we can't answer this question. We can't fall favorably on one side or the other using empirical methods such as scientific methods to say whether or not there is a separate reality that is immaterial, and that's what our mental states are, versus the material processes of the brain. Okay, take some notes. For there is no conceivable experiment which could decide between materialism and epiphenomenalism. This latter issue is not like the average straight-out empirical issue in science, but like the issue between the 19th century English naturalist Philip Gosse and the orthodox geologists and paleontologists of his day. So these orthodox geologists and paleontologists were arguing for a kind of scientific explanation of fossils, and of course Philip Gosse was pushing the creationist account. According to Gosse, the Earth was created about 4000 BC, exactly as described in Genesis. That's part of the Bible, guys, which twisted rock strata, evidence of erosion and so forth, and all sorts of fossils, all in their appropriate strata, just as if the usual evolutionist story had been true. So in other words, the Earth was created to make the evolutionist story look like it was true. Take a note. Clearly this theory is in a sense irrefutable. So he's saying I can't argue against this theory. No evidence can possibly tell against it. Let us ignore the theological setting in which Philip Gosse's hypothesis has been placed, thus ruling out objections of a theological kind, such as what a queer God who would go to such elaborate lengths to deceive us. He's saying, look, here is a theological argument. We're not going to explore it, but this is an example of something I'm talking about, which is, isn't it strange that God would go to these lengths? But we're going to dismiss that argument and move on to something else. Let us suppose that it is held that the universe just began in 4000 BC, with the initial conditions just everywhere as they were in 404 BC, and in particular that in our own planet began with sediment and in the rivers, eroded cliffs, fossils, and the rocks, and so on. No scientist would ever entertain such a serious hypothesis, consistent though it is with possible evidence. So in other words, the creationist theory, which is that the Earth was created to make evolution and geological processes look like they occur, is consistent with all the evidence, but no scientist would accept that theory or hypothesis. Take a note. The hypothesis offends against the principles of parsimony and simplicity. That's what we covered before, Occam's razor. There would be far too many brute and inexplicable facts. So he's saying if the creationist account was true, there would be far too many brute and inexplicable facts that just couldn't really be explained. Why are pterodactyl bones just as they are? No explanation in terms of the evolution of pterodactyls from earlier forms of life would any longer be possible. We would have millions of facts about the world as it was in 4000 BC that just have to be accepted. So in other words, we just have to take these things we saw on face values because we couldn't actually use evolution as a way to explain the facts. Remember, what's really clear to understand here is that the creationist account of fossils still fits with the evidence, but we wouldn't have the explanatory power of evolution to allow us to explain these random facts. Like, why did God create fossils of pterodactyl bones to look just the way they were? Whereas we can use evolution to do that. The issue between brain process theory and epiphenomenalism seems to be of the above sort, assuming that a behaviorist reduction of the introspective reports is not possible. If it be agreed that there are no cogent, remember that relates to inductive reasoning, guys, philosophical arguments which force us into accepting dualism, and if the brain process theory and dualism are equally consistent with the facts, so in other words, he's saying brain process theory and dualism are consistent, and there's no logical argument that is forcing us into accepting dualism, then the principles of parsimony and simplicity seem to me to decide overwhelmingly in favor of brain process. So this is now, if you're a really good note taker, you would say, look, if there's no cogent or logical philosophical argument which forces us into accepting dualism, and if the brain process theory is aligned more with Occam's razor or the principles of parsimony and simplicity, then look, we have to be overwhelmingly in favor of brain processes theory. Because as I pointed out earlier, dualism involves a large number of irreducible psychophysical laws whereby the nomological danglers dangle. Okay, so that's why I put here a picture of the dangler. Dualism creates lots of extra, superfluous, unnecessary explanations for what actually occurs, whereas really, if there's no logical argument pointing us towards dualism, then just by using science we can explain things away without those additional laws, all right? And they're of a queer sort, and they just have to be taken on as trust. It's difficult to swallow as the irreducible facts about paleontology on Earth with which we are faced on Philip Gossi's theory. Okay, so you should have some notes. Just pause the video for now, read over your notes, read this section again. You know, if you have a very good understanding of these two different bits, then you really do understand the reply to most of the objections, okay? Which is good, very good. Once you've done that, I just want to go through two issues which we'll be exploring a lot when we read the next text. Okay, so the first thing is basically, and he hasn't really gone out of his way to argue for it, he's just assumed that you're going to accept his principles based on Occam's razor because he thinks that's the simplest argument. But he's claiming an appeal to the authority of science, right, which doesn't give us any ironclad a priori arguments for his propositions. All right. In fact, all of his evidence and all of his hypotheses can only be proven through contingent or inductive logic or reasoning. So, you know, like I said, you know, you can confuse correlation with cause and effect, can't you? There might be underlying factors causing brain states. There might be many other things going on. And so, you know, you really do have Hume's problem of induction. You can't observe the same phenomena in every single instance and then say, well, actually, this is 100% concrete. You've only got like a probable understanding of what's going on. But you also don't have that tight, and it's what we call leak proof, because it doesn't really leak into any other kind of assumptions. You don't have that tight a priori logic of, you know, bachelor equals unmarried man, you know. You don't have that kind of real tight stop, finish, everything has been proven, ironclad argument of a priori logic. Instead, you just have to rely on inductive logic and contingent observation to prove or to argue for your scientific fact. So it's never going to be 100% certain. And look, we all know that Smart acknowledges that, but he still thinks because of Occam's razor, and there is no real, from his point of view, logical argument compelling us towards dualism, that this is, you know, most likely going to be the correct argument. So can you just take a note about the appeal to the authority of science? Okay, and now for the last one, which is explored in the next text we're going to read, which is what is it like to be a bat? So the reason why I've got what is it like to be a bat is that we could foreseeably do smarts analysis on the brain processes of a bat and understand it 100%. But does that mean that we ever fully understand what it is like to be a bat? And that's what we're going to explore in the next text. See, the quality of experience might be something that can never be reduced to purely physical phenomena. And let me give you an example. We all know from a scientific point of view that the smell of a rose involves picking up scent molecules, processing it through the nasal passage, and sending it to the brain to be processed in some meaningful way. Everybody would argue that that causes the mental state, most people would, of the smell. But is that, you know, how can we actually say that the smell of a rose or the smell of a flower is this chemical and biological process? We can't. It might have just its own unique quality over and above it. And that's what we call the problem of qualia. And many have said Smart's analysis of this doesn't really take into account the fact that maybe experience has its own kind of separate reality that can't be reduced purely to physical phenomena. Take a note. All right, so what have we done today? We've definitely named and defined several key terms: parsimony and simplicity, Occam's razor, the creationist argument versus the evolutionary argument. All these terms have been thrown in there to help us analyze. We've looked at epiphenomenalism as a form of dualism, of which there are many. And please, I'm going to say this really loudly, do not argue that Descartes was an epiphenomenalist. He was not. Descartes believed the mind had control over the body and could interact with it. Epiphenomenalists simply argue that brain states create mental states, but mental states have their own separate reality. These mental states do not have any effect over the physical world. They are two separate theories. Descartes' mind-body dualism is not epiphenomenalism, right? We've definitely looked at concluding points. We've looked at the concluding argument that you cannot answer the question or side on the side of materialism versus dualism using empirical reasoning alone. You have to relate to philosophical arguments. And you can never empirically prove, you know, the dualism or the materialist argument wrong or right. That's because when you look at it, it's similar to Gossie's creationist account of fossils, right? The fossils and all the evidence can be explained away through the creationist account. Same goes with the evolutionary account. The only refuge you've got is Occam's razor, which is based on the principle of parsimony and simplicity. And the problem is arguments like creationism provide nomological dangles. In other words, it provides so many other explanations and points of view, and they also make it really hard to answer certain questions because, you know, you can't use evolution as an account for the evolution of why pterodactyls look that way. You just have to take into account that pterodactyls look that way. The same goes with mind-body dualism. If you were to accept the argument of dualism, then you're accepting the nomological dangling, you know, and certain realities and certain experiences of the way things are just simply have to be accepted as extra bits that cannot really be questioned. Whereas the brain process theory just gives you a pure scientifically reductionist argument for what mental states are. It's simple, it has much more explanatory power, and it doesn't overuse explanations or create unnecessary explanations or create questions that can't be answered. All right, that's it. If you've got any questions, come and talk to me, and don't forget to answer the exam-like questions.